Hello, everybody. This is Craig Fugate, former administrator of FEMA, and really want to thank the folks at IWCE for having me on board, particularly since we have a very life-threatening hurricane, Hurricane Laura, intensifying today and is forecasted to make a landfall along the southwest Gulf Coast as a major hurricane later this evening. And part of what we wanted to talk about today was communication, uh, the public, and the role that volunteers play in disasters and the challenges they face. I had an interesting call. It wasn't had anything to do with this conference, but I had a call from a gentleman who had actually been part of the response with chainsaw teams in Cedar Rapids after this derecho that occurred last week. And he said, one of the problems we had as volunteers was there was no central point to check in. There was very little communication. Cell phones were out. Power was out. Uh, Radio communication was only for the emergency responders. These folks didn't have that. And when they finally were able to link up, they really didn't know where they needed to go. People couldn't tell them. And so they just went to where they saw the need and began operating. And they said, here's our problem. We're trying to help. We can't ask anybody where we need to go. Nobody can tell us where we're needed. And we're going to go and show up. And we want to help. But we're not as effective as we could be. It'd be really great if there was some way that we could have all communicated. And we've seen this time and time again. If you go back and you looked at after action reports, it is always, communication is a huge issue. We usually have focused on the public safety responders, the fire, police, emergency medical services, even utilities and public works crews being able to communicate. And we put a lot of emphasis on building systems for those folks. But we have left out one of the most important responders in all of these disasters, and that's neighbors. What sometimes are called spontaneous volunteers. What I like to say is people helping people. And we've seen that time and time again, an outpouring of assistance, but often not where it may be needed or most effectively employed because communication systems are down. I remember a statement from Hurricane Andrew. Some of the survivors down there saying, for the first couple of days, you only knew what was going on as far as you could walk and as far as you could see. And that even if assistance was 2 blocks over, you may not even know about it unless somebody tells you, because there was no communications. And this is pre-cell phones, pre-internet, pre-apps, pre-streaming. But the devastation was so extensive that unless they had a portable radio, they couldn't get any updates. And fast forward to Hurricane Katrina. We're now in the era of cell phones. We're now in the infancy of streaming and apps. And again, increasingly, the public's coming dependent upon things like Wi-Fi and cellular phones. And in Katrina, these again were taken down. Cell service across the region impacted. And again, a lot of response agencies utilize cell phones daily. They use them in emergencies. They're an effective tool. But in these disasters, they were, again, not functioning. And we saw the challenges of that response. We've seen this in tornadoes. We've seen this in hurricanes. We've seen this in wildfires. The Napa wildfires, there was up to 200 different cell sites that went down during the fires. Most recently, fires in California, we continue to see how electrical systems going down, the failure of cell sites that are in the fire zone, and the lack of communications really hinders both getting information to the public and being able to respond. And I've always, tried to approach this from the standpoint of what's the best solution to improve communications? What are things that we have that are survivable and that we can use? And it always brings me back to radio. And I don't think people realize this. Your cell phone is a radio. It is designed primarily to communicate over cellular networks, but it is a two-way radio. It transmits and it receives. And today, most people have a cell phone. So if we start talking about how we can improve communications for people in the field, particularly not the the lights and sirens, but the spontaneous or the neighbors helping each other, and communities that are impacted being able to support each other during these disasters. I start with a cell phone. And the question then becomes, well, if the cellular networks are down or congested, what good is that cell phone? Can't get cellular data. I can't get to the network. It becomes a brick. And I'm going, well, not quite a brick. It still has two radio channels that are not dependent upon the cellular networks. And that is Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. Wi-Fi of longer range, Bluetooth of shorter range. And we've seen some interesting applications of what is called mesh technology, which is a fancy way of saying that instead of having your Wi-Fi router talk directly to the network, it talks to other Wi-Fi routers and builds a mesh of router-to-router communications. As long as the routers can see each other, they can set up and communicate among themselves. And by using things like mesh networks, a cell phone that can see that Wi-Fi network can potentially communicate with other phones on that same Wi-Fi system that are linked through that mesh. This is something that the military originated, but we've seen both amateur radio operators as well as hackers building networks off of repurposed commercial routers. The router you have in your home probably plugged into a cable network that provides Wi-Fi signal throughout your house. And they have repurposed this and reprogrammed this to be able to set up mesh networks, and in some cases actually operate over microwave frequencies that they can operate on, and set up networks that can literally carry data tens, if not dozens of miles. In some cases, we've seen some networks so sophisticated they can cover over 100 miles. And if that mesh network can reach back to a working internet location, provide internet capacity. Again, it's not cellular data, it's not cellular voice communications. But once you're connected back to the internet, you can do things like voice over IP, you can do FaceTime, you can do Zoom, and you can start communicating, and you can get information. And these networks are rather, they're not exactly what I would call off-the-shelf technologies, but it's this idea that we can take and build systems that allow cell phones that people have to start communicating in an area where very little exists. There are commercial applications. Some of the folks I work with have built these types of things so that it's more turnkey. It doesn't require reprogramming routers and setting up. And companies like goTenna that have built these applications that, again, was primarily for their first responders, is actually something we can use to plug in volunteers. And for local emergency managers and local officials, it becomes a very, I think, attractive way of doing this, particularly since FEMA will provide funding match for volunteers. For most disasters, when FEMA provides assistance, and obviously as we're watching Hurricane Laura, we're going to see this, federal assistance is generally a cost share with state and local governments. So the federal government, or FEMA through your tax dollars, provides up to provides 75% of the cost of uninsured losses, cost of response, cost of cleanup. And so particularly in the current economic situation, that match requirement is going to be difficult for state and local governments who are already under tremendous pressure from COVID-19. But the cool thing about volunteers, whether they are part of the organizations like the Red Cross or Salvation Army or all the other organizations that are part of the national voluntary organizations active in disasters, or national VOAD, and your state and local groups, spontaneous volunteers are neighbors helping neighbors. Those hours count, and FEMA allows state and local government to track those hours and use the volunteer hours as match for those disaster costs. So instead of the 25%, they can generate part of that match from volunteers, but they have to be able to track it. And it's important that a lot of these groups that do this, including ham radio operators. We try to track our hours, and I am a ham radio operator. I'm KK4INZ, so I do this in my spare time when I have it. All those hours can be used to be identified as match for this. So if you start thinking about from the standpoint of local government, figuring out how to build and support either commercial applications or working with amateur radio and other folks to build these mesh networks. Some of the cool applications on there is as people log into the network, you can actually track their location and their hours. You can start collecting that information, but more importantly, by building these types of networks, you can start putting people back in communication. You can start getting people where help is needed, where resources are. And this idea of being connected is critical. When Superstorm Sandy hit, we had began discussions at FEMA with our communication folks. And their primary focus was always on the state and local government and the response community. And I kept asking, what can we do for the public? And they were initially not sure that they understood what I was asking. I said, look, because we have so many devices that are Wi-Fi capable, when we have congestion or systems go down, if we can provide Wi-Fi connectivity, people with their own devices can now start taking care of their needs, getting information, letting people know they're okay, registering for assistance, filing insurance claims, and getting updated information that may not be available most anywhere else. So in parts of the Sandy response in New York City, our FEMA communication folks set up satellite receivers, and we set up Wi-Fi stations with, because we had the generator stuff, we set up charging ports so people could charge their phones. And it turned out for a lot of folks, particularly in areas that were lower income, people didn't have unlimited data plans. And even when they had cellular data, with congestion and the cost of that, they would run out of minutes. And so providing free Wi-Fi became an important public service. But FEMA can't be everywhere, and FEMA can't get to every disaster. So where we can build Wi-Fi networks, particularly this idea of mesh networks that says if everything else is down, if we build a mesh, people can communicate with each other. We can move away from what we found in Hurricane Andrew, that the survivors were literally down to only thing they knew was as far as they could walk and as far as they could see. So this becomes one of the challenges in disasters. How do we communicate? How do we provide information to the public? And then in the aftermath of the disaster, if communications is down, what tools and capabilities can we help provide so people can communicate among themselves? This idea of what I call government-centric response and government-centric planning really misses, I think, a big opportunity. And again, we'll see this play out with Hurricane Laura, is a number of folks that will pitch in to help, yet communications still comes back as one of our key challenges. And there are some folks that say, well, they're not really trained, they're not on our systems, we don't really want them. And my response to that has always been, if you have all the resources and you don't need any more help, we call those emergencies. In a disaster, you don't have the luxury of turning away people. What you do need to do is figure out how you're going to provide communications so you can better coordinate and plug them in where they're needed and support that response. But never forget, the fastest response in any disaster I've ever seen is neighbor helping neighbor. So the more that we can take these devices that we carry in our pockets and remind ourselves, that's actually a two-way radio. And even when their primary communication purposes of cellular and data are down, they still have that two-way radio function over Bluetooth and over Wi-Fi. And if we can take advantage of mesh networks, working with organizations like Amateur Radio, working with the commercial sector that have built Go kits and tools that can be rapidly deployed, And remember, not only are we going to improve our response by getting past this notion that if I don't know where I'm needed, I'm not sure I can help, and plug people in more effectively. It's also the ability to track the hours, and that is a dollar value. It is a significant amount of dollars that can be used for match. And at the local level of government, in these disasters, these are budget busters. And so for every dollar we can capture from volunteer work, we can then match. And FEMA doesn't require that the volunteers be part of any one organization. It just requires that you're able to track and document the volunteer hours in service to support that disaster response and recovery. And for each hour, you get a certain amount of funds available that you can use as match. And so it becomes a cashless match. It's an in-kind match. But if you're not tracking them, if you're not aware of them, you don't have the ability to document them, you lose that capability. So think about everybody with a cell phone that pitches into disaster. If you could track those hours, how much match you could generate if you're on the other end of one of these disasters. And as we're watching Hurricane Laura bear down on the coast, we got to remind ourselves, as much as we love streaming and apps and the internet, when these technologies go down, we're often left to the radios. Whether it's the portable radio in your disaster supply kit that an FM radio station is going to provide updates, to the mesh networks. Providing communication tools that are survivable are going to be key to make sure that people have the information they need getting prepared, but also during and after the storm to know where they need to go and what they need to do to stay safe. So with that, I thank you for having me, and I think we have a little Q&A, and I'll stand by for that. But I appreciate everybody tuning in today. Our thoughts and prayers go out to the folks that are facing Laura and these other recent disasters. And hurricane season, we haven't even hit the peak yet. That's usually in mid-September, so we got a ways to go. So we wish everybody luck, and again, I'll stand by for questions. All right, well, as we're going to wrap up, and we do questions later. If they come in, we'll respond to them after the fact. Again, if you're in the evacuation zone, head to higher ground. Stay tuned to your local broadcasters and stay safe for Hurricane Laura.